Good morning, good afternoon, good evening around the world. My name is Doug Brunke. I'm the founder and CEO of Global Chamber. We have a really timely and important conversation today. It perhaps a month ago could have felt like a post-COVID view of how to go back to work. I would say at this point, this is not exactly what's happening around the world. I just jumped off a call from Serbia and have been talking with various places around the world. It's not exactly a post-COVID world, is it? It's happening and continues to happen. The conversation I had in Serbia was that they're expecting the fifth wave in September of COVID. And in fact, the fellow I was speaking with, who's becoming our leader there in the country, just got COVID for the second time after being shot with the Chinese vaccine earlier this year. So he had COVID, he got the Chinese vaccine, and then he and his wife and his mother, who almost died, all had the vaccine, and they were kind of okay, but the mother almost passed away. So we're in it for the long haul, and that makes this topic even more important because it's not going away. You've got to kind of manage through this. And there are certainly issues related to, work from home and, are people going to come back to the office? You could ask that question. I'll tell you the answer. The answer is yes, and certainly most companies don't really have a choice on that. And many already are doing it. We had an event yesterday, and I believe out of the 5 people, all of them were in a work office, to Zoom in. None of them were home, and there were other employees there. So people are already going back, unfortunately, probably unsafely. And so the purpose of today is to give you, first of all, a sense of what's happening in the market, probably more North American focus, but as much as possible, kind of give a global view. And then, what are some of the technologies and thoughts to handle these in a safe and productive and affordable manner? And so really pleased and appreciative of the experts that we have assembled today. We have 3, Mike Moran, who's the CMO and Director of Risk and Sustainability Practice at Microshare. And then we have both Rich Robillard and David Armitage. They're both of SBL Testing Technologies. The way they were explaining it to me earlier was that SBL largely is getting in the building. And they'll be providing more specifics about that. And Mike with Microshare, they have a much more holistic approach in a lot of different areas. And these two go together really nicely. And so you'll be hearing more about what the solutions are, but we thought we'd start first with what's happening. A year ago, we had certain ideas. 6 months ago, we had ideas. A month ago, there were thoughts about the next steps. I remember 6 months ago, one of our members who handles a variety of COVID-related products and services said, gee, everything's disappearing. This market is, no longer. Well, again, not exactly. And so, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate, I know you're all busy with getting product out the door and getting people to understand, what some of these solutions are. But how about we start with that first part and what are you seeing out there? And let's start with Mike. You've been in this business now for a while. You have a little bit, in fact, very a wide view of the market and what companies are dealing with right now. How would you describe the market for a post-COVID going back to work?
I'd call it on their back foot. The market is reassessing plans that were drawn up probably first at the end of last year, thinking that once the new year rolled around, we'll get back to work, and it didn't happen. Now Delta, of course, the Delta variant, really threw a curveball. The Microshare deals globally. I mean, we have people, in smart facilities that we empower from Singapore to Australia to, North America to Europe. In fact, Europe is our biggest clients. So there's a jurisdictional question here. In various places, there are different labor laws. So there's different things you can expect of a labor force in the European Union or the UK from the United States. In some places, you cannot say, you got to get vaccinated or else you can't work for us. In the United States, it's all precedent, right? That'll all inevitably make its way through the courts. But right now, it looks like companies feel empowered to say those things, but they're not, from a reputational risk standpoint, they're not willing to do that. So there's a huge reassessment going on. One of the things I would emphasize here is that early on in the pandemic, we were already tracking certain trends, like the transfer of the workforce majority from the baby boom to the millennials, right? There's a very different sensibility about work, sense of loyalty toward a corporation, et cetera, expectations of your employer. And then also the social governance movement, which was already starting to affect what companies needed to do in terms of taking care, duty of care to their people, carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think COVID has supercharged the perception of the social aspect of ESG, how employees are treated, the safety and wellness of employees. And at the same time, it has made everyone, not just facilities managers, who used to be the people who cared about this stuff, but HR directors, general counsels, chiefs of strategy, even CEOs. What's happening inside the four walls of my facility is now an existential issue. That used to not be true. They didn't care. They gave it to the facilities managers or the real estate portfolio managers. That's now a strategic question. And so the kinds of things we do, air quality monitoring, all sorts of density sensors, water quality, water usage, all those things are now suddenly strategic issues when they were kind of nice to haves before COVID.
Interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way. I think part of what's driving that, right, is it seems like there's a bit of a shift of where employees have a little more power than they had 2 years ago in the employer-employee relationship. There's this, belief that there's the Great Resignation coming in September. It already seems to have started in some places. And so employers are looking to hire and retain good people. And so is that part of the dynamic as well, where, like you say, the management of the company, this was a given, right? Who really didn't worry. Maybe in the tech firms in San Francisco that were intensely fighting over people, they were worried about the ping pong tables and all of the other dynamics within the workforce. But these typically in most areas haven't been considered. And now there's layers of additional things that they're thinking and worrying about.
Sure. And again, pre-COVID, we were already seeing a shift from the fat end of the baby boom, where there was a surplus of labor, to Gen X and millennials, where in Gen X, remember, the US population that was added every year really dried up during the Vietnam War. Kids were just not born the way as quickly as they were prior to that. That meant that group of people coming into the workforce tightened labor markets. Then you have attitudes from the millennials, which is basically, we've just done the greatest pilot project you could ever have done to prove that you can work remotely, right? So a lot of these younger workers are saying, I'm not coming to the office. I might come in once or twice a week, but if you want to retain my services, you have to push. So the labor management dynamic has shifted in favor of labor for the time being. We'll see if that lasts. I mean, some of that might be, pay me $600, I'm going to sit on my couch. But I think this goes right up the pay scale. It's not just, low skilled and low paid workers. This goes right up to your most important people. And that goes back to the question of who cares about these facility management capabilities that we do, the smart facility stuff. Used to be HR didn't care. Now HR is worried about retaining their most important employees, recruiting talent out there in the world, and also making those who come back to work, you almost have to lure people back to the office, and you better have something to show when they get back that says, we get it. We saw COVID. We know now. We didn't see this before. Look at the things we've done. And some of those things can be powered by technology. And the nice byproduct there is everything that would make people feel better in an office also will increase the efficiency and bring ROI. So that old facility manager who used to be our buyer, they cared about operating budgets. Can you lower my operating budgets? Absolutely. But now he's got allies in the C-suite who say, yeah, and we can also re-recruit our employees and retain and recruit new employees. That's a really good place to be.
Okay. And technology can help facilitate that and be used as an asset rather than kind of just doing the normal stuff. So I'd like to. Go ahead, please.
It has a risk mitigation component to it.
There you go.
I think SBL comes in as well. Obviously, the great tragedy, and we had clients who couldn't go home. We had a lot of clients in manufacturing. GlaxoSmithKline. We're in 22 factories of theirs around the world. They can't stop. They can't send their workers home. They don't make any revenue if they do that. So they needed something to prevent outbreaks, and we created a kind of wearable contact tracing app that helped them do that. And they never shut down. There were never major outbreaks in any of their plants. So, and that's where I think I want to introduce, Rich and David. They deal with the front door, which is another risk mitigation tool, and it's very much complementary to the kind of stuff we do inside the building.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. So yes, Rich and David, feel free to move forward. Either of you start. What I heard from Mike was that companies are on their back feet, which, from one aspect, management hasn't really worried about these things before. That's probably part of it. The other part of it is there are a variety of technologies that are available that even people who have been, somewhat knowledgeable about this area, they may not know what these things are. So there's two elements of that, right? So what are you seeing? And I presume that's what you're seeing on a daily basis as well.
Well, I think Mike hit on a key point. I mean, companies haven't experienced this kind of crisis management before, whereas, crisis management teams were risk, safety, high level executives. This has been so far reaching into organizations, right? As Mike explained about the labor pool and the shift, we've now proven that you can work from home in many circumstances. But we have a lot of clients in the industrial sector, the energy, oil and gas, who simply cannot have their employees not attend the workplace. We need them there all the time. So these people have been putting together crisis management teams, and you're right, it's all been very reactive. It has been on the back foot. And they are looking at technology, testing technologies, facility management technologies, and trying to piece them together right for each organization. And that's one thing that's really critical. Mike mentioned the fact that there's regulatory discrepancies. I mean, the reality is governments haven't handled this pandemic very well. So we get inconsistent messages, we get inconsistent regulations, approvals for devices or not devices, and companies are left on their own to try to figure it out. And I mean, the reality is they need to figure it out because they know their business best, the nature, their customers, their employee base. But yeah, it has really been a day by day, week by week. We work with some very large, mature multinationals in the energy sector, and they are flying a bit by the seat of their pants. And a lot of them were in a wait and see. I think a lot of people thought vaccines were really going to bring things back to normal, or a new normal, as people say. But, now that we see variants, and not just COVID, now they're thinking about pandemic risk much more holistically, because, COVID will eventually be settled or, managed to an acceptable level. But now the threat of pandemic risk is real, and companies don't want to get caught on their back foot again. So I think they're looking at what's best for their organizations and trying to integrate technology as part of that overall solution. But there's no one technology, one silver bullet. It really goes down to each organization.
We often talk about that we're not going to return to normal. We're going to change fundamentally for the long term. This we can think of as a smarter normal, a more informed normal, and we'll all get back to work, and we'll get back to live concerts, and we'll get back to vacationing, but we won't return to the kind of oblivious normal that I think we can look back on and say, Oh yeah, no employee would ever be drilling a prospective employer with questions about, tell me about your safety protocols before I come to work here, right? That would never come up in a job interview, and it sure as heck is now, right? These, these employees have tasted work from home, and if they're going to be brought back into the workplace, they're going to be full of questions that are new and they're novel for us. And so as employers, so I think that we need to be cognizant of the fact that our normal going forward is going to be a much more informed, smarter normal than what we've had in the past.
Really, really great perspective. Thank you very much. Mike, anything there that surprises you? I mean, that's probably what you're hearing as well. And why don't you kind of transition us into kind of the next phase? For the next few minutes, we'd like to talk about, beyond, these challenges and these issues that many of which, I think maybe all of which are totally unique from history, especially given what some of these solutions are. Why don't you begin to transition us into kind of the holistic view of some of the different things that are available, and then we'll get back to the back door, to the front door and the back door with SPL.
Sure. So I think it's very, very smart the oblivious normal that we used to live. I love that phrase, David. I think what we're seeing now is, I was a journalist for years and was in New York for 9/11 and covered all the aftermath. And one of the things that we all know is that the way that you got onto an airplane changed radically, and it changed permanently. It used to be you could take your kid and your wife to the gate, say goodbye, honey, and off you went on to the gateway. That's not going to happen again. So there was an infrastructure that was created and an expectation that was created after 9/11. There was the TSA, founding of TSA, the whole metal detector thing, the whole, sense that you were going to literally have to open your suitcase or carry-ons. All of these things were somewhat surprising when they first happened. And of course, it took a while to get them to be as roughly efficient as they are now. But they were permanent infrastructure that came after a crisis. That's going to happen here too. And the types of things, and if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen, Doug. The types of things that I believe will be the infrastructure of the new normal, if you don't mind me using that cliche. Can anybody see what I've put on the screen here?
Yep, yeah, we can.
Okay, so this is what we have a number of solutions that we recommend for various types of buildings. And as I said, they bring all sorts of benefits that are much more on the OpEx side, financial. But these are the type of things that we believe will assuage the concerns, create data feeds that didn't exist before, so that you understand how the environment and the physical plant in the building is affecting the wellness and health of the people inside of it. So, for instance, in an office setting, we have a kind of sense that indoor air quality monitoring, room occupancy, and desk occupancy, which are the kinds of things that kind of monitor density in a given space, but also allow you to book desks, for instance, in a hybrid environment. Touch-free feedback is a kind of employee engagement opportunity, but it also tracks problems and gets ahead of problems, whether it's a leak in a bathroom or some kind of a unsanitary situation. We have these kind of different packages for different types of places, hospitals, water temperature sensors, for instance, predictive cleaning, which is a data-driven cleaning. The way people clean buildings is even changing. The typical stance, so, a cleaning company comes in and they treat it like patent treated, Northern France and Germany. There's this much territory we're going to go through, we're going to clean it up, right? That's, first of all, margins are very low in that business. There is not time and there are no new resources for that cleaning crew. Now they should be cleaning the places that need to be cleaned, the places that were actually used today. And that's an occupancy sensor and the people counting sensors. So you can increase efficiency and get the same space cleaned even better for less money. Then schools and universities, there's all sorts of stuff that help with the classroom environments, the very dense environments that exist in these places. And obviously the cleaning is irrelevant. Asset zoning is a kind of a way to track mobile equipment. And there's a lot of mobile equipment in a hospital or a factory or a university, whether it's, the kind of, projectors and screens that people have, or just simple things like whiteboards and stuff. And you can waste a lot of your staff's time looking for these things that just get put in a corner and forgotten. So that's the kind of building we're thinking will ultimately be a normal thing. Air quality sensors, they should be in every place. The CO2 levels in a 1970s and 1980s buildings, which were built without windows you could open and with miserable ventilation, CO2 builds up, and by the afternoon, your employees are literally falling asleep. There's studies that show that the productivity absolutely disappears during the afternoon in those settings. And at the same time, humidity and temperature is tremendously important in the spread of infection. If you optimize these things, you lower the risk of infection spread, whether it's COVID, whether it's the Delta variant, whether it's influenza during flu season, or some epsilon variant, which God forbid we don't see. But ultimately, I'm going to stop sharing. The idea is that buildings can now speak. They are no longer just brick and mortar dumb assets. They can be living, breathing, data producing assets that you can manage the way a doctor would manage a patient with vital signs in a hospital.
Interesting. And so the things that you just went through, the three things I wrote down was indoor air monitoring, predictive cleaning, and touch-free feedback. And that those may not be the three that you talked about, especially the last one. I'm not totally understanding that. Are those buckets of areas where you have solutions?
Oh yeah, those are the names of the solutions that we would deploy.
Okay.
Pay for themselves in 6 months, basically. And ultimately, they have as with everything we do, and kind of an ESG way of thinking, there's a double bottom line. There is the wellness and health and reassurance it provides if you share this data with your employees or staff or tenants or customers. And then on the other side, there's enormous operational efficiencies. So you save money on the OpEx for a building. So we see this as once we get in front of somebody, it becomes a no-brainer. We're working with, for instance, Aramark, one of the world's largest facilities managers. And for the Denver audience, we just put predictive cleaning in the Broncos Stadium. So ultimately, these are things that once you get past oh my God, this is new, do we really need this? And they see the potential ROI, and then they get the message from the top that, listen, we got to do something to make our people comfortable being inside this building. Then it becomes easier for them to carve out budget, move forward, because again, they pay for themselves very quickly anyway.
Got it. Part of that value must be like in employee retention. And I think all three of you talk about risk and risk mitigation of, let's say, a lawsuit or something where somebody, either one person or more are affected by something detrimental, including COVID.
Every single one has an eccentric and unique ROI. So simple question, a simple example, leak detection sensors. You put those on pipes. Okay. Every pipe leaks. Almost every pipe leaks. Even if you don't have a catastrophic leak of some sort, you're going to save 6% a year on your water bill because you're identifying where these leaks are. Now, let's say you run a multifamily apartment building and there's a leak on the 9th floor. 4 or 5 floors are going to be damaged. You're going to have to put up those people. So there, it's a risk mitigation tool. So we don't even include those in our ROI figures. That's something that is above and beyond. That's a risk mitigation for an unplanned, semi-disastrous maintenance and repair. But ultimately, most of these things have many aspects of ROI. And in that case, it's a very simple financial return. But in the case of air quality monitoring, for instance, there's lower absenteeism. There's the reassurance of knowing that you're not breathing carbon dioxide and and that you're in an environment which minimizes the risk that an infection will spread throughout the building really rapidly. So those are the types of things that I think companies had a hard time getting their mind around pre-COVID, but COVID has shown a really bright spotlight on the value of these things from a corporate operations and duty of care standpoint.
That makes sense. Rich and David, those are all things that are going on in the building. Getting the right people and protecting the building, if you will, from people who may or may not have COVID is an important attribute as well. And I know a lot of your solution centers around that. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you could share the screen, Doug, I can kind of walk through what that looks like when we're talking about people. I think as Mike mentioned, it really is customer to customer and what their objectives are. I think when it comes to people, it was a little bit more even on the foot, back of the foot, and now they're starting to look much longer term. So how do we do that? I mean, everything was kind of reactive testing, on-site testing with rapid tests, and then we looked at, PCR testing and quarantining. That's basically all people could do for the longest time. And now they're shifting gears and starting to look, how do we manage this long term, not just for this pandemic, but for future pandemic risk. Doug, are you able to share my screen? I don't know. If you're able to share my screen, I can show a little bit about what we're talking about when people are walking through the testing phase and screening phase. And what's nice is we are seeing technologies advance here pretty quick. Let's see this out.
Should be working. There you go.
Okay. So what we've seen kind of to date is, let's see if this works.
We see a snowstorm.
There we go. So we've seen a lot of on-site testing. That's how industrial clients, manufacturing, anyone that needs people on site. And, it's been working. The nature of this virus, antigen tests are pretty good. They're quick. They give you a yes, no. You can make a decision from there. Obviously, if they're negative, they can move on to their activities. Positive, we can move on to a higher level of testing, quarantining. And companies are putting in these procedures and policies, which have really, kind of grown over the last year and morphed as as the pandemic has stretched on. So they've got a little bit better at it. The one thing we are seeing is obviously there's industry and the workplace, but it's interesting because we're seeing schools, we're seeing environments such as tourism. How do you apply this to tourism? Like we're working with Caribbean countries that want to reopen tourism. So how do you integrate testing as part of that solution? And again, the overall objective is always about limiting risk, limiting exposure and moving back to that confidence, people having a sense of safety and building new cultures in the workplace. Driven by leadership, though. At the end of the day, it's always going to be driven by leadership. So we are now seeing technologies. We're trying to leverage optical AI-driven screens that can actually take one step back. Can we create an actual go, no go in front of the traditional testing? So for instance, we're working with a technology now called Safe Entry, which is an optical high throughput, where basically people can walk through and within 4 seconds, we can detect if they have symptoms of infectious disease. So what's nice is it's not restricted to COVID-19 or the variants like Delta. It could be influenza or it could be future risk. So when Mike talked about building infrastructure, that's exactly what the screening and the testing is moving for. So not only are we identifying people that go in very quickly with, under 4 seconds, we're giving them a screen where we can detect if they have any symptoms. And if, of course, they don't, then we can move right on through. If it's a workplace, they can go. If they're on a tourism area, they can continue without going back to be quarantined. For schools, we can move kids in very quickly. And of course, if we do detect symptoms, well, now we're moving towards a secondary assessment, and we're not actually focusing on testing everybody every time. the challenge that we have with that, in many mine sites, for example, that's exactly what they're doing. But a nasal swab every single day or every time you enter site, it is still invasive. And if your objective is to build culture, it is to build a sense of safety, there still has to be a non-invasive component to it. You still have to make it as easy for the worker as possible. And the beautiful thing about AI-driven screening like this is that it continues to learn. And there's a feedback where you can take those secondary assessment results and feed it back. So now you're survey testing, there's surveillance testing within your workplace. And at that point, we are learning more about the nature of our workforce, the prevalence of infectious disease within our communities, and companies can adapt accordingly. So, you know what, it's moving towards a direction of trying to make things quicker, simpler, more efficient, yet still keeping all of those layers of risk mitigation in place. Like, this doesn't take away from any of the other best practices of masking, sanitization, facility management, like what Mike's doing. I mean, you need all these pieces to really create what's right for your own workplace. And we don't want to take away from all of these pieces, because the reality is, anybody in the risk mitigation world knows the Swiss cheese model. The more pieces of Swiss cheese you can lay on top of one another, the less chance something's going to get through all of the holes. So now we're seeing new technologies like Safe Entry come forward, and it's changing how companies can manage that risk. And they're still in an assessment period of what's right for them. So as I mentioned, schools are looking so we can move more kids through. It's objective. Now people, we've all experienced the delegation or the declaration, how I feel, have I been exposed? Well, those are really subjective. There's some people that need to work, so they may mislead on that so they can go in. There may be people that don't want to work, so they mislead on those declarations. Now we're screening objective data, which can tie into the bigger picture, which is exactly what Microshare is doing. So these technologies are coming forward, and they're only going to get smarter and smarter. And what's interesting about this technology in particular is it's exactly what Mike said about 9/11. It is something new. The customers that we have using this now, it's new, but it's building confidence. And what they're suddenly feeling is this is simply that smarter normal. This is the new normal for us moving forward. And I mean, of course, industrial sites make sense. We have one client who is a manager of commercial office buildings, and they simply put it at the bottom of the building to attract their tenants to bring their employees back. Again, the whole concept is building confidence, building safety in a much less invasive manner that people can get used to. And again, it still ties into all of the other elements. But the technology is getting better. We have seen AI especially move forward in the medical field, and now it's simply spilling over into the workplace, into tourism, into schools, into governments. And I truly believe that these kind of tests are going to be the norm, and companies are going to use them differently. They're going to build procedures and policies around them that align to their operational needs, align to their workforce, and align to what the leadership's objective is. And this will be the smarter normal moving forward. And it will continue to advance, as it is a machine learning kind of technology.
Rich, can I jump in and just second that motion? One of the things that people are finding, and I see you make the point here that this is not just about COVID. There's plenty of concern out there beyond the COVID world. Is that the sudden appearance of data that tells you what's actually happening inside a building or at the front door, it's just the beginning of a journey. And you'll find that people in your building go, oh my God, we can see that. And suddenly, for instance, in the GlaxoSmithKline factories that were deployed in, they went from understanding that they could do a reverse database search to see who had been in contact with someone who might have symptoms, to realizing, oh, now we can see, also patterns of movement within the building. We can see the, who was in various areas of the building at what times of day. Obviously, there's the whole data-driven cleaning aspect of that. So there's all sorts of things that build off of these things. And the beauty of some of these things is that they're anonymous, but actually the more technical term for that is pseudonymous, which means that they're anonymous until there's a safety and wellness reason to reveal who it is that wears that badge, or who it is that, that data came back on. Because the ultimate idea here is to protect other people from infection, right? But every single solution we offer has these knock-on capabilities, risk management and sudden efficiencies that hadn't really been part of our sales pitch, but which our clients are, taking the ball and running with.
Well, and but Dave, just one note on that, Mike, is the reality is when this pandemic started, corporations were scrambling for tools. They weren't even at the data point. Now they're getting data. And what does data do, especially objective data? It allows them to make informed risk decisions. It gives them more information to make the right decision for their organization moving forward. So now we're not only creating more layers of risk mitigation, but we're giving them tools to make better decisions as we move forward.
And a final word on this, because we're global, we were conditioned to speak about the COVID pandemic as American Brits, where there hasn't been a real pandemic since the 1918 one. But our customers in Saudi and in Southeast Asia were like, whoa, you don't have to explain this. We've been through MERS, we've been through bird flu. They already get this. They've already had to shut down multiple times during the first 2 decades of this century before COVID. So they get it. And they also know, much more than Americans do, that the next one's not necessarily going to be 2118, right? This could be tied into climate change. It could be tied into all sorts of things, globalization and the movement of people across borders, so that these pandemics may be a recurring thing. And that might not be a coronavirus pandemic. It might be something different, but they want to be prepared now for the next one, so that there's not this sudden need to shut the whole business down.
Hey, Doug, there's a very important question, I think, in the chat, dealing with track record and efficacy. And so we see a technology like this one that Rich has got on the screen right here, Safe Entry. And what we're really up against when we think about how do we more effectively screen at the front door of a building or a concert is handheld thermal imaging temperature readers. And CDC report came out a couple of months ago showing that there was as much as a 40% false negative rate from the handheld thermal scanners that all of us have been hit with. 40% false negative rate. I mean, that is outrageous. Now, there was a large-scale research project done on this multispectral scanner that's inside of the Safe Entry system, and that large-scale study showed that the effectiveness of Safe Entry was on par with the best of the rapid antigen tests. So upwards of 90% effective scanning for COVID, and that is a remarkable game changer to be able to get to use multispectral array like this to get to that kind of effectiveness at sensing the 7 symptoms that Rich has got on this slide. And the other important thing about machine learning technologies like this is every time that we run a test, one of these PCR tests, for example, or a rapid antigen test, the feedback loop that gets created makes the machine smarter. So over time, every time we scan somebody and they get a green or a red, and then we go through the test process, the machine gets smarter and smarter and smarter. So this technology is really a game changer when it comes to getting people back together again.
Very, very interesting. And so when you talked about track record and kind of maybe related to that question, what do we know? What's been implemented? And then how fast is technology changing? I gather in this one question that the thought process is, well, just wait another month and there'll be a whole round of new ideas and thoughts. And so I'll stay involved, but, kind of make decisions down the road. I get a sense that these are technologies that are out there, are tested, and they're basically things that people should be thinking about implementing today and not waiting.
Well, safe entry is still a relatively new technology. I mean, it was in R&D for quite a few years, but test proven last year. And then it started to implement earlier this year. Now, implementation is going very quickly. And that's the direction we're seeing with multinational mining organizations also, is what they're looking for is they're looking for consistency, right, across the board. Because as Mike said, these are global issues, right? I mean, this pandemic is not restricted to any one part of the world. So large organizations want consistency right across the board. And so, I mean, it's moved us into industry sectors that we are not really familiar with. I mean, the tourism one is fantastic. These Caribbean islands are looking not just to put these at airports, but literally put them at every single restaurant, every hotel, every tourist place. So now you're vaccinated, now you've had a PCR test, you've quarantined 3 days, and now you're a tourist on the island. Well, you may walk through this 3, 4, 10 times a day. As long as you're green, you continue on. If you're red, then we're going to do an on-site test. And if you fail that, you would move back to your hotel and get quarantined. So application is really driven by industry. It's really driven by organization. And it's been a great learning curve for us. I mean, from the traditional, heavy industry applications. So I think we're going to see adoption incredibly rapid because, as Mike alluded to, I mean, this is infrastructure. If COVID lasts another week, another month, another year, but there is going to be pandemic risk moving forward, and companies are not going to get caught with their pants down like they did in the beginning of last year.
Yeah, and there's also the issue of post-pandemic realities, and again, going back to that 9/11 analogy, things eventually smooth out. The new infrastructure that's put in place is regularized, is standardized, and it becomes a normal thing now at an airport to encounter all sorts of things that you didn't see before 9/11. So I think you're going to have the same effect in offices, in factories, in any indoor space where you're going to be able to register a complaint with a QR code, where you're going to be able to see whether if you're about to get up and go to the cafeteria in a large office setting, whether there's 1,000 people in that room or just 15. And that may just be a matter of convenience post-pandemic, but it's going to be a data point that you can access with your cell phone or on your desktop or whatever. It's going to change the way offices work, and it's going to make them more efficient. You don't want your employees standing in a line 15 deep for a coffee at the cafeteria. If they can know that in 20 minutes there's no one there, I'll go in, quick hit, I've got my coffee. So there's all sorts of post-pandemic issues of benefit that I think we're going to see become permanent part of the new realities.
Yeah, a couple different industries have been mentioned, or at least I took away kind of the multinationals with operations in multiple countries are looking at this maybe at a more macro level. I would imagine they're one of the leaders in implementing here. On tourism, that's vital, right? To get people to feel safe within the community. So they're looking at technologies to be able to create that level of safety and perception of safety. I'm wondering where you're seeing, where is the greatest, where are the early movers on this? And I got to believe there's also like a series of maybe most of the companies, going back to the flat-footed comment, most industries, most areas are not taking the actions that they need, and maybe they're taking a wait and see. So where is the activity happening, and then where can you imagine this kind of proceeding next, and over what time frame?
So, Doug, that was true. Sorry, that was true 2 months ago, or even a month ago. But we all know the situation is evolving hour by hour right now. I mean, this Delta variant is as much as 6 times more infectious than the original COVID-19. 6 times. Every single person that gets it right now will infect 6.5 additional people. Ebola, 1 person infects 2. The seasonal flu, 1 person infects 1.5 people. Okay. The original variant, the original COVID-19 variant had what's called an R naught between 1 and 2. So basically the same infectiousness as the seasonal flu. Not true. Delta variant changes everything. And so this situation is evolving hour by hour right now. So we're seeing, I think, explosive interest coming from industry, coming from government, coming from schools, coming from venues, because as a society, we moved on. Let's face it, when we got vaccinations, we started to come back and thought, great, we're on the other side of this thing. All I need to do is get vaccinated and I can go back to acting normal. Yippee. All of a sudden, everything is changing hour by hour right now.
Really frightening and important point. I've also heard from a couple sources, I presume this is true, that there's a Delta Plus variant as well. And so these other additional ones, based on not just relatively low and certainly not complete vaccination rates in some of the developed countries, but when you look at Africa as an example, or the other day I was speaking with someone in Bolivia, where that's 1 or 2%, similar to Brazil and Peru next door to each other. You've got much of the poorer parts of the world with very, very low vaccination rates, and so there's going to be a tail on this, right? In addition to some of these variants.
You're right. These are incubators for variants. And every time we have a breakthrough infection, it's an opportunity for the virus to experiment with, oh, I wonder if this trick for circumventing the antibodies post-vaccination is going to work and help me get around them. So every time we have a breakthrough infection, it's another opportunity for that virus to learn and evolve.
Absolutely.
It's a frightening situation right now. It is.
Doug, I host a podcast called Manifest Density. And one of my guests recently was an epidemiologist from Johns Hopkins, and she was arranging a podcast for some of her colleagues. And she said, "You're a marketing guy. What should I call it?" I said, "How about waiting for Epsilon? Because that's right after Delta, right? Because you don't have to go to Botswana, go to Arkansas, go to Mississippi. Those rates are low enough. Vaccination rates are low enough for a mutation." And so the mutation in the American Southeast might be quite different than one that comes out of someplace like Bolivia or Paraguay, but it's going to be a mutation. These things don't just sit around and say, I like Delta, we'll just stick with Delta. This is an animal,
On that note, and to your point, Doug, I mean, what it is I think there's normally a technology adoption curve, right? I mean, early adopters, and then you get into the more conservative mainstream after that. I think that's even thrown out of whack. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Dave was talking day to day. I mean, we were talking with some of our major energy clients here in the last month, and they were like, we're in a wait and see mode. We're starting to de-escalate our COVID initiatives. We're waiting to see what the impacts of the vaccines are going to be on our workplace. Things are starting to open up. Fast forward 30 days and they're like, hey, hold on, man. We're now escalating back into our COVID protocols and we're looking at adopting technologies sooner than later. We have a couple of clients, pretty mature clients that have always been from the front. Look, we're not the first adopters. Once there's 3 or 4 other major companies using this technology, we are there. We are technology driven, but we're not the first. Well, that order has changed a little bit, and it all depends on how much downward pressure they're feeling by loss of operations or impact on their labor force. And I get we're talking about the big companies, but we're seeing, for instance, like individual senior homes that have bought and put in a safe entry because they do not want sick people coming into their senior home. Or we're seeing that with hospitals. So there is also, actually, it's interesting, there's a yoga place that put one of these in because they want to maintain their yoga operations, right? So it is a wide scale and people are reacting to technology a lot differently than I think, the traditional adoption of technology.
Yeah.
So really the time to act was last month or the month before. And so, and you're seeing that happen right in front of you. I'm wondering, are governments beginning to react, let's say with helping to fund some of these things? Are you starting to see that? And is that something else that you can help with in terms of advising or guiding companies that are making this shift? Or are they pretty much on their own? They've just got to kind of get this thing belly up to the bar and get it done.
Well, we need a whole other podcast to talk about how the governments have addressed these pandemics. And that's not restricted to any one country, Canada, US, or around the world. I think they're going to be reactive, but I don't really see too much of a proactive stance by the governments at this point, because they want this behind them. They want this behind them more than probably anyone else. So
I'll go on.
Seeing something differently.
I'll go on the record and say, look, schools where the vaccine's not been certified for kids under 12, and so schools are going to become the most virulent incubators of this Delta variant, and I think we're going to see governments, government and public sector, react very, very quickly this fall with technologies like both the technologies that Mike is talking about with density and occupancy and air quality monitoring, as well as better safeguards than the thermal imaging or the thermal scanners that are at the front door right now. We're going to see adoption of all of these technologies by the public sector.
Sounds good. Rich and David, we've come close to the end of the program, and what I'm wondering maybe would be great to hear from each of you individually. What did we leave out? What are some other points that you'd like to emphasize? And certainly let us know more about what the next step should be. What should people do next? And perhaps Rich and David, do you mind going first, maybe in subsequent order?
Rich.
Okay, sorry. You know what? I think companies and organizations in governments now are taking this more serious, and it's unfortunate that it's taken 18 months. The one thing that I don't know if it was left out, but people have a lot more confidence in technology now. I think it's much more advanced. When we first saw screening and testing coming in, it would be nice to see the regulators be a little bit more less politically driven. How about that in terms of approvals and authorizations for technologies? But it really still, for me, always comes back to aligning to the objectives and the needs of specific organizations, companies, governments, because even though I got a risk management background, my job is I don't know any one organization better than they know themselves. We're there to help, and technology is there to help. And just know that it's not the silver bullet, but it's part of the solution.
I think I just want to absolutely amplify that critical point, which is these are layers of defense. Nobody has a silver bullet for this thing. And if we had one last week, it's not working this week. This is an evolving situation, and we're going to need layers of defense. And what both of these firms represent are some critical components of a multi-layered strategy that's going to be essential for us to bring people back into the workplace and back into communal settings in a safe and predictable way. And without these technologies, we're operating blind. And I use that term oblivious normal that we were living in the past. We have to get way smarter. And I think that these technologies are critical components of doing that.
Yeah, and I would just say that those who are making these kind of decisions in the corporate world, in the public sector for our infrastructure, for terminals, airports, need to think about not just this moment, but where this leads. These are all capabilities which are not simply emergency capabilities. What COVID has done is it's pointed out a vulnerability that you have. This isn't just a thing that ends with COVID. You are vulnerable to a global pandemic, right? You probably are vulnerable to all sorts of other risks that some of the other solutions that are that I went through are going to address. So becoming a more resilient company through technology is a no-brainer. This is a part of the digital transformation journey that every company's been on since the internet was invented, right? This is just an extension of it into an area that protects people and protects your assets. Ultimately, though, I'd also, point out that from any particular stance, whether you're an HR director, whether you're concerned about liability, like a risk manager or a general counsel, whether you're worried about continued growing of revenue and the maintenance of an affordable overhead and OpEx, those are all things that these solutions will enable. Your sick workforce costs you money. A workforce that is afflicted by a pandemic requires in some cases to just shut down. The food processing industry, manufacturing were at the forefront of this, again, because they didn't have the luxury of sending their white collar workers home to work and produce revenue from home. They can't do that. So ultimately, we battle tested a lot of our stuff in that environment, the COVID related facility stuff. But as a human resources manager, for instance, we're talking to a lot of them. We're going to SHRM, which is the big human resources conference next month. There's a huge interest in the ability to manifest this data to the employees so that it shows a caring sense by the employer. That, look, we're not just putting you in a building and saying good luck. And we have real stories about people who have been able to retain workforces and retain key employees because they're willing to take steps like this, and also been willing to and be able to, forestall labor union action in some cases, because they would be able to say, listen, they brought the labor union leaders into the actual conversation, says, here's what this does. This is not just protecting you, it's protecting your family. Because if you get sick and go home and your mother who's living with you gets sick, then there's a possible tragedy there. So ultimately, a kind of transparent, open conversation has been the best case, the best practice that we've seen in any kind of change management process that has to happen when you start installing sensors. Because of course there's a cultural aversion to, oh my God, they're watching me. They're watching me every minute of the day. They know when I go to the bathroom. Those are terrible, things for an employer. There's a way to have this conversation, to explain what these things are, to understand that the privacy concerns have been addressed. And then that is a much better, healthier conversation to have with your employees than to have to just shut down and furlough them.
What becomes very clear is this is a business decision, right? It's smart business. It's the risk mitigation part, but it's also employee retention. So I really appreciate the three of you framing things up in terms of what's happening in the market right now, how over the last just couple months, things have dynamically changed, probably in a historic way. And now is the time, yesterday was the time to act. But now that, we've heard what you've had to say, save your business, get your business on the right track to be able to not just get this current wave, but the next waves of this particular pandemic and others going forward. Mike Moran is with Microshare, which is at microshare.io. And if you'd like to get a hold of Mike, contact us at globalchamber.org, info@globalchamber.org, if you haven't already got his contact information. And the same with Rich and David at SBL Testing Technologies. All of these gentlemen, both of these companies have things that you should know about, you should be implementing already, and we strongly recommend it. It's not a case of, do I wear a seatbelt or do I get vaccinated? It's not a personal decision. It's, if you're running a business, you want to be in business next year, and the way to do that is to be smart about it. So gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time today. Looking forward to learning more and keeping up to date. I can definitely see that this is one of those topics that's an ongoing topic, because in a quarter from now, or even probably next month, we'll have a lot more information. But definitely, as companies out there listen to this, take action now. Thanks, everybody. We've come to the end of the program. Watch for a blog post and the recording as well. And I'd like to wish you a great rest of your day and week. Take care, fellows.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.